Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. We've traveled to Ohio today to Fremont, and we want to say thanks to the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums for hosting us here. Collector Mike Fahle is back with us, and we're going to meet another soldier through his uniform. Mike, who are we meeting today?
So today we're talking about James George, who was first a captain, then a lieutenant colonel, and then colonel of the 2nd Minnesota Regiment.
Well, this takes us all the way back to the beginning of the digest, because in the very first shoot we ever did, one of our first episodes was Fieldcraft, and it was called Hellfire Stew, and the primary source came from Bircher from the 2nd Minnesota. So here we are again.
Absolutely.
Let's start off. Before we go to the war, let's meet George.
Okay, well, James George was actually born in 1819 in Jefferson County, New York. As an adult, he would work in Buffalo as a bookkeeper and then also a teacher in Canada. He would later move to Ohio to Butler County, where he would serve on the Register of Deeds and then also the Secretary of Public Works. It was around that time that the Mexican War would break out, and then he would join and be a captain in the 1st Ohio Infantry. He would serve in the 1st Ohio Infantry during the war and was severely wounded at the Battle of Monterey.
Wow. Okay, so even before the Civil War, he has public service and military service on his record.
That is correct.
Great. Well, let's bring him forward. Do we know what he does between the Mexican War and the Civil War? How does he get to Minnesota?
So he winds up in 1854 moving to Oronco, Minnesota, where he utilizes his soldier's bounty, his land deed, and buys a farm there. He would spend 4 years as a farmer, but then move to Wasoja, where he would become an attorney. There was also a seminary there that he was actively involved with. I think it was called the Free Will Baptists, and they had a seminary school there that had roughly several hundred students.
Great, and we're thrilled that the Dodge County Historical Society in Minnesota has preserved that law office. When we think about the Grand Law Office today, it's a really small building, but it's another connection we have to James George.
Yes. So when the war breaks out, he would actually use his connections with the seminary that many of those students would then join and would form the core of his company that he was originally a captain of. But when the regiment actually came together and rendezvoused, he would be elected lieutenant colonel with his past military service.
Where does the 2nd muster at?
So the 2nd would muster at Fort Snelling. And then he would be, like I said, elected from captain to lieutenant colonel, and then he would eventually become colonel by October of '61.
Again, as we look at this wonderful artifact of his, 2 rows of buttons on the federal officer's frock coat, evenly spaced, will give us a senior officer, not of a general's rank. So this is major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, and I see the infantry officer's I button here.
So originally, this jacket was rescued from a costume company in Minneapolis. There's a stamp in the left sleeve, or excuse me, the right sleeve, and it was picked and went through a dealer, and it's been fully vetted. It has a beautiful inscription where it says Colonel J.S. George, USA on the back.
Okay, I was going to ask you, coming from a costume company, I'm like, how do we get provenance to James George? But I guess if you got his name inside the lining.
Right. Yeah, so somewhere along the lines, the family probably donated it, and it wound up being used as a costume. So then it went through a vetting process through 2 very prominent dealers. Everything was found to be legitimate, the inscription and so forth, and now it wound up in my private collection.
What else do we have of George and of the 2nd Minnesota here today?
So an interesting thing is that James George, he wrote at the Battle of Mill Springs that the men had engaged the enemy. They were roughly 12 to 15 paces apart. And when they did engage, they were able to sometimes reach out and pull the enemy's pieces from their hands. They were so close. And that sometimes the men, when they presented their weapons towards the enemy, would receive bayonet wounds in their left hands as the enemy was presenting their weapons towards them as both were firing at each other. And that was actually written in a report that he did a few days after the battle, I think January 26th of '62.
And you've got the jacket of one of the men who was there, and possibly the jacket that he could have worn there.
Absolutely.
Between the 2 of us. When we talk about connection in Civil War Digital Digest, it doesn't get much closer than this, because I'm not sure when you're going to get to see this, but we're recording on Saturday, the 18th of January. Tomorrow is the anniversary of Mill Springs. So we've got the jacket here. You've got insignia.
So under magnification, by looking at how sharp the angles are in the actual photo of George, measuring kind of like the loft, the height of it, and just how crisp it was, and it didn't appear to be braided wire, so almost 99% sure that they were Smith bars, which
Okay,
was
let me
unique.
stop you. You need to say, talk to me about what a Smith bar is.
So Smith bars were quite unique in that they weren't necessarily the velvet and the embroidered bullion wire. You know, you'd have your bullion wire and then your dead bullion and all the mix of those that give you that nice striation of really good period shoulder boards. They were actually made out of brass, and they still had the velvet field, but the body itself, instead of bullion, was made out of a brass stamping. Also, whether it was lieutenant bars, captain bars, major, lieutenant, colonel, those were all inserts. So you could truly take what would be a second lieutenant bar, and as you move through the ranks, have nothing in the field for second lieutenant, then put single bars for first lieutenant, double bars for captain, etc. It was an economic way that you could continuously change your rank without having ones that were actually embroidered in bullion.
And this is a contractor that you could purchase as an officer.
That is correct.
Fantastic.
Yep.
And these boards?
Those boards are a perfect example of Colonel Smith boards. Beautiful blue field, the nice bright silver gives you an idea. The backing here gives you an idea of the velvet backings that they would have for them. But other than that, they're a good representation of what would have been on that coat.
Best we could figure. These aren't Georges, but these
No,
based on the
they are most definitely not Georges.
So they go together as an example,
Yes,
and that's the reason
that's
you
correct.
haven't attached them,
That's
because
correct.
these aren't his, and this jacket
Yes,
stands
that's
as
right.
it is.
I just want something to be able to show someone of what would have been on the shoulders, but not actually put them there because I wouldn't want to misrepresent the coat.
What else can you say about the inside of this
So
jacket?
what's unique is it's actually done of a buff white cloth, where typically you have the light green or the black linings. It's still quilted. It's not as quilted as fancy as Eastern Theater jackets. I think simply because they were Western Theater, and really when you think about it, Minnesota in 1861 is somewhat the hinterlands of North America as far as the United States goes. So I think it shows a very much more plain, economically sound, and simpler version than the fancy stuff that would be found at maybe one of the high-end dealers in New York, Baltimore, or Washington, where the officers could go into their military tailor and pretty much smorgasbord fancy features, from belting to piping to a bunch of different features that there's a dizzying variety of. This is just a very simple, humble coat, which kind of goes along with a simple, humble, faith-filled guy.
And let's move him forward. You've gotten us to Mill Springs.
So James George would command the regiment. He would go on in 1863, prior to Chicamauga, he would go on an extensive convalescence of illness. And he would return to the regiment for a few short days, but right before Chicamauga gets sick again. Well, he told the men, it's captured in the regimental history, boys, there's a big fight coming, and I promise you, if I'm alive, I'll be back for it. So he vanishes to the hospital for a few days. The day before Chicamauga, comes back, commands the regiment through that battle, has his horse shot out from under him 3 times on Snodgrass Hill. He then survives the battle, writes his battle report after, and then goes on extended convalescence. That would go until, I believe, June of '64, where he resigns due to personal sickness.
We've got a bunch of other things laid on the table here. What are we looking at that support George and the 2nd Minnesota?
So here we actually have some documents. There's roughly, a little over 50 documents of Company D. There's a couple other companies where there's maybe 1 or 2, but predominantly they're Company D of the 2nd Minnesota, and they're their quarterly returns. So from a living history perspective, if you've ever want to do a living history where you present Company D of Minnesota, you could go down man for man of exactly what they were drawing at the time. Interestingly enough, it was all forage caps and 0 hat brass.
How did this piece come to you as far in relation to the jacket?
Well, sometimes in collecting, you get lucky, and then sometimes it's like there's just good fortune, and then sometimes it almost feels predestined. Reason being is that I was at a show, Mansfield Civil War show, one of the largest in the Midwest, and this jacket was there. It's the first time I saw it, and a friend of mine who's a collector, he was able to obtain it, which I obtained it from him. But ironically, just a few tables down was this folder of these 50-some odd documents that belonged to the 2nd Minnesota. So those two just kind of, fortune brought them together and was able to put them together and kind of have a little bit of a grouping other than just the jacket. The other irony is that George, to his pre-war Civil War history, being in the 1st Ohio, while I myself have a 4th great-grandfather who served in the 72nd Ohio, wounded at Shiloh on the 2nd day. However, his pre-war history is he also served in the 1st Ohio.
First Ohio Mexican War.
Mexican War, yes, and was also wounded. So again, George and my ancestor were not in the same company, but in the same regiment at the same battle and wounded at the same battles.
You talk about putting the stories of a person or the stories of a group of men together by having James George's jacket and regimental company paperwork from one of the companies. We show a little bit more of the 2nd Minnesota in one place.
Yeah, definitely builds the world out.
Great. Well, as we bring it to a close, what more do you want to say about George's post-war life? Obviously, resigning for health, he's broken down pretty good by the war.
That is. He pretty much goes into retirement and passes away, I believe, in the late 1870s, early 1880s.
What do you want to leave us with a thought about the man who wore this jacket?
Well, when you look at reading the regimental history and you look at how well respected the men speak of him in the regimental history, and that he was so sick for so long and promised the men that if he wasn't dead, that he would be back to lead them at the big battle that he felt was coming, that would ultimately be Chicamauga. It would be the dedication that he had to his men. It very much seemed like to me when I read about him, read the regimental history, hear how the men speak about him, that he was very much a caretaker of those under him and would want to make, kind of almost shield them in a fatherly way from all the harm that he could, albeit, hard to do in war, but with the best intentions.
Sounds a little bit like what we might call servant leadership today.
That's correct, yes. Yep, very much so.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you for caring for these pieces, and thank you for making sure we understand what the boards look like, but not trapping us into thinking these are his boards, but it's a great representation. So, and love that you share these stories with us, Mike.
Oh, I'm pleasured and humbled.
Great. Well, thank you for spending your time with Civil War Digital Digest. We always talk about finding a connection to history, and I think I did for James George today, and I hope you did too. Let's add another C word to the list: community. From the CWDD coffee grinders, our patrons who provide the funding to make this happen, from the previous collector Jeff, who cared for the jacket, to Mike, who cares for it now. Dodge County Historical Society in Minnesota preserves the law office, and Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums gives us a place to film. There's a lot of people working together to bring this story to you. Hope you've had a great time with it. See you next time.